we're going to end with, I think, an equally fantastic end to the day. I know from being in a lot of the workshops this morning and this afternoon, we've had some really important and critical discussions, self-critical discussions about how we campaign, how we make change. We want to finish the conference today with an opportunity to reflect on some of those discussions and to consider what some of the next steps might be for all of us, whether as individual activists, whether as community or voluntary organisations. How do we actually put into practice some of what we've heard today? What do we learn from today? How do we change things in the future? So we've talked about how we influence policy, how we build coalitions, about the role of grassroots community organising, as well as some of the critical themes that we have to consider around adequate incomes, housing, just transition, taxation. We've covered a lot. And so I think now what we want to do is, what do we do with this? What do we learn from this? And how do we take this forward in a way that I think is hopeful and positive? Because we've also had discussions that are clear-eyed about the scale of the challenge that we face. So we want to inject, or maintain actually, that feeling of hope that I think was there in the opening session, and consider how we can develop our anti-poverty movement in Scotland in the future and meet the big challenges that we face. So we've got another fantastic panel to finish the afternoon. The way that we're going to do this session is we're going to hear from Jonathan Cox, who is Deputy Director of Citizens UK, Claire Telfer, who is Head of Scotland for Save the Children, and Amal Azadin, who is down here as a freelance activist, but I think that sounds like that diminishes what you've done. You may know Amal from being one of the Glasgow girls from 20 years ago now, we discovered earlier, who was involved in campaigning in Glasgow 20 years ago, which you may say a bit more about. And we'll hear some reflections from them on what inspires them or their organisation to make change, and to think about that. And then from there, we'll go back to tables. We'll go back to you to think about what inspires you, what gives you hope, what your organisation wants to do following this conference to make change, or what you will do, and what support or what role the Poverty Alliance as the anti-poverty network in Scotland can play in providing some of that support. And then we'll come back to hear a bit from you and have a little final roundup from our panel. So, with that said, Jonathan, over to you. Jonathan, as I say, is Deputy Director of Citizens UK. For those of you who don't know Citizens UK, they are a community organising foundation and an organisation that the Poverty Alliance has worked alongside for more than 10 years now, particularly around the development of the living wage in Scotland, development of the living wage campaign and accreditation. And I think we have a lot to learn and work with with Citizens UK. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody, for the welcome. And it's great to be here, not least because I've done most of my organising in Wales, building broad-based organising there. And often when we're in Wales, we look to Scotland for inspiration. You may not know this, but quite often, as we're looking around thinking about how do we think about social justice, what kind of things do, we tend not to look to Westminster, or at least haven't done for a very long time, but we often look to Scotland, not just to the devolved administrations here of various different types over various years, whether that's been around the living wage or the perspective they've taken on refugees and so on, but also in terms of what people are doing to campaign for that as well. So I hope I can offer something of our experience in Wales that may be of encouragement and of use to some of you or not, and I sort of offer it to you kind of in that way. I want to start just by offering a couple of learnings that I've had throughout my life that's brought me to organising. The brief we were given for this session was share something that inspires you or your organisation in making change. And the thing that we have at Citizens UK fundamentally is a method. Okay, we are often well known for campaigns around the living wage, or a campaign to end child detention, or whatever it might be. Some of these things very, very local, others scale up to the regional or the national or even the UK level. But fundamentally, what we're about is a method for everyday people to be able to make change. That's what kind of animates us. And I guess that's kind of the only thing I have to offer you, because the one thing I should say, I feel a bit of a fraud on the panel, we don't operate in Scotland. And we only go where we're invited. So if you want this model, we're open to having an invitation, but you'll need to extend it at some point. We'll be delighted to help you. We recently had the launch of Liverpool Citizens last week, building a new broad-based organisation there. It took them 2 years to build that organisation there. So new ones springing up all the time. But how do we get there? I'm a little bit reluctant to say this because historical references were given a bit of became a bit of a joke in this morning's session. It's not a musical one, although I do have my own little karaoke number we can throw in at some point. I want to say that the first lesson, big lesson I learned in life was that I grew up during the miners' strike in the South Wales Valley. I think most of you here at least will know what that is. Anybody remember Arthur Scargill? Yeah. My first recorded words, my dad still has them on audio cassette, were Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher. Okay. Apparently, my dad was a vicar. I used to insist on wearing a tie to church because that's what Arthur Scargill would have worn. Not convinced entirely he would have gone to church, but there we are. I grew up in a very contested context. I remember in primary school being in my primary playground, watching them landscape the tip from the colliery that had closed several years before. And look, I don't want to aggrandise coal. I don't think I'd ever wanted to be a miner, but the only reason for the community I grew up in to exist was the mining of coal. And that industry was shut down in a way that had no regard for the people who lived up in that community. And as the bulldozers were taking that tip down, they might as well have been levelling the life chances down of every kid growing up in that community. So the first thing I learned about democracy and politics growing up was that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. Yeah? If you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. I went to school. I got very involved. I wanted to change stuff. I stood for head boy. I thought I had it nailed. I lost in a humiliating way. And my head of sixth form brought me in afterwards and said, Jonathan, you've learned a really important lesson today. And I said, what's that? He said that you were neither good-looking nor charming enough to win an election without organising. That was also a learning about how democracy works. I ended up working in Westminster for an MP and a government minister for a while. And what I learned there is that politics and democracy is too important to leave to the professionals. Okay? It's too important to leave to the professionals. They're good people, by and large, trying their best, but they cannot make the kind of change that our communities need on their own. And we cannot expect, the mantra growing up for me was, well, we just have to wait, Jonathan, until we get a Labour government in Westminster and a Labour government in the Welsh Assembly and a Labour government in a local council, and then all our problems will be solved. And that was very comforting for people during the Thatcher era. There was a long period of that, and the fundamental issues in the communities that I grew up in remain. And so what we've done about that in Wales is really think about, we cannot wait for the state. I agree with what Danny said this morning about the importance of the state in regulating the market, but the state is not powerful enough to do that on its own, and we need to do a better job in civil society to organise to try and make sure it does a better job of that. The final learning was I went to work after Westminster in the Refugee Council. I was very passionate about that issue. I was angry about how the government at the time was scapegoating asylum seekers. And I saw an organisation that did amazing casework and service delivery work and was very good at campaigning, but had no power. And so we just lost time and time and time again. And my learning there was, if you want change, you need power. Yeah? If you want change, you need power. And that's what attracted me to organising. I got involved with London Citizens at the time, which was kind of the only broad-based community organising outfit at the time. And as I went on that training, initially attracted by, how could we use this to make life better, to organise in refugee communities, to enable people to campaign and act for themselves, to be able to make change. I also began to think about, actually, we could do this in Wales. And I spent about 3 or 4 years then working with civil society organisations in Wales who invited us in, having got interested in the model as well, to look at what would it look like to have broad-based community organising in Wales. And we built it. We built a permanent alliance of civil society organisations, churches, schools, mosques, trade unions, schools, community organisations, anywhere where people gathered on a broadly voluntary basis. Probably the kids in primary school might argue about whether they're there voluntarily. And people developed together an agenda that they review democratically all the time, and they commit to working together and acting for change. And just to fast forward, what does that look like? quite a few of you today were talking about, we need to organise. What does it mean and what does it look like to organise? Well, I'll just paint you a little picture. Imagine you're walking into the First Minister's office of the Welsh Government for the first time. You've had a big accountability assembly of 700 people where you brought all your people there to do a deal with those politicians and to say, if you get elected as First Minister, will you meet with us on a regular basis to act accountably on the issues that we're putting forward to you? And we have that first meeting. And 15 of us are prepared to go in, community leaders from across Wales. And we're planning it, we role play it several times in advance to work out what we're going to do. We've got our agenda, we've got our asks, we know what happens. We turn up early, we make sure we get in the room, and it's a beautiful room. It's where the First Minister does his press conferences. It's got the nice plaque up on the wall and the flag. And there's a lovely chair that's got, like, you know, it's better than all the other ones. And we decide we're going to sit in that chair. I mean, not all 15 of us, but the person co-chairing the meeting goes and sits in that chair. And we all position ourselves around the room. And the First Minister and his entourage comes in. He's doing the glad handing. Great to see you all. And then he starts to move towards his chair. This was the previous First Minister. His chair. And he sees someone sitting in it. And he's kind of like, sort of indicating that's my chair. And our co-chair looks at him and says, this is our chair. You work for us. We're just so delighted you've made the time to meet with us. We've got an agenda. Let's get cracking. And from that moment, the entire dynamic of the meeting switched. It was at that point we got commitments to community sponsorship of refugees in Wales. We got commitments to the implementation of the living wage. And it was the basis of a relationship with Welsh Government to do something which actually you'd inspire us to do already in Scotland, which was achieve the real living wage in social care, which Wales had talked about doing for many years. But it was only through organising, consistently putting pressure on those decision makers and training people themselves, care workers sitting directly opposite the First Minister and demanding that he introduce the living wage. And not only that he do it, but how it is done. Being there around the table all the way through that process of implementation. So that's what I've learned about organising. As you can see, I'm a convert to it. I think it's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the world's problems. It sits alongside other ways of making change, advocacy, the lobbying stuff that you guys already do so brilliantly. But certainly we in Wales thought this was something that a string we wanted to add to our bow. And if that's something you're interested in Scotland, we'd love to have that conversation with you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks. I think there's undoubtedly appetite to learn from that experience of community organising. We'll see how that develops over the weeks and months to come. Claire Telfer has been involved in Save the Children for a number of years and leading Save the Children now for at least 5 years, I think. Save the Children, as we know, has made an enormous impact in tackling poverty globally, but also has programmes that are impactful in Scotland and across the UK as well. And I think it would be really interesting to hear, Claire, from you about what inspires you to stay involved in this work, what sustains you in this work. Over to you, Claire.
I'm just reflecting there on, I actually took a group of parents to meet with John Swinney, the First Minister, last week, and I'm deeply regretting not thinking about which chairs we were sitting in. And that maybe speaks to some of the things we've been thinking about at Save the Children. I thought I might speak today about the work we've done in the last year to think about ourselves as an organisation. We've talked a lot today about change and how to make it happen. And actually what we've done over the last year is kind of looked inward at ourselves and thought about how are we contributing to tackling poverty in Scotland and bringing about that change? Have we been part of the problem? Are we doing enough? Are we doing the right things? What do we need to do differently? So actually at the start of this year, we embarked on conversations with our community partners, with families, with funders, with people that we work with people that we don't work with, to hear what they thought. What did they think was needed in Scotland to help end child poverty? What did they think our role was? What were we doing well and what we could do differently? And it was a really inspiring exercise. Wish we could do it every year, because we were so grateful to everybody that gave us the time to share their reflections and their thoughts. But what we heard was that we do need to change and do some things differently, and that's what we've started to kind of put in process. So yes, we've got a long history of working with children and young people in Scotland and across the UK, but we really wanted to think about you know, child poverty has become too familiar in our communities, almost too familiar to notice, and that we need to be doing more to change that. So actually we've changed our mission, and we've talked a lot today about power. So our mission was to help reduce child poverty, but we've changed that, and it's now how can we support children, young people and families to have the money, services and power they need to help end poverty. And power is really the theme that kind of runs through what we've been thinking about as an organisation. How do we give up the power, maybe not all of it, but a lot of that power, and give that and support children, families and communities better to build their power. And that's something that we've been thinking deeply about. So what is our role and how can we do that? I don't think we've got all the answers yet, and it's been really interesting hearing all the reflections today. But a couple of things that we want to focus on. One is, and we talked a little bit about this morning, I think Laura Young was talking about children and young people's voices and experiences, and where are they in the debate in Scotland about tackling child poverty. And as a children's organisation, we don't feel we've done enough on that. There's brilliant examples of people sitting next to somebody who's an expert on this. But we have lots of examples of groups of children and young people doing amazing things who want to speak out and do more, but perhaps don't have the resources or the networks or the access to those in power, those decision makers, to make that difference. So what's our role in connecting up those organisations, those partners, those children and young people with those that can do something about this? And so we're really thoughtful about how we do that, and particularly thinking about that at national level and how we make sure that all the work that's happening locally is kind of connecting up, but also how we can be a better partner to grassroots activists, community organisations, organisers, those partners working in local communities who every day are supporting children and families, and thinking about, is that about capacity building? Is it about resources? Is it about our networks? And we heard really strongly from partners that actually that's something that they would like from us and like to think about what that would look like. And that will be different for different people. But the important part, I think, is that we're starting from what people are telling us that they need. And the other area that we've been thinking about, and I guess the kind of overall concept, if you like, around this is collective impact. Some of you might have heard about this. There's a lot of kind of research around social change and the different approaches to bringing that about. And our approach really is about collective impact. So it's basically saying, how can we all work together on a shared purpose to achieve that bigger change? We need the activists, we need the grassroots, we need the researchers, we need those that the thinkers that can kind of do the policy work. We need the funders. But are we all kind of working collectively together on enough of a shared goal? Do we understand the different roles we're playing and how they come together? So the other thing that we want to look at, and there's been lots of conversations I've been involved with over the last few months about civil society, the third sector in Scotland, and thinking about what is our role? How do we maybe get back to our kind of radical roots and think differently about what we could be doing? So can we help kind of convene some of that thinking and bringing people together? And for that, we need to be really clear about what we're all working towards, how we can connect and support each other and capacity build, and really understand the kind of the system. Because I think we've got great examples of individual projects, campaigns, pieces of work that we've done with families, that we've done in coalition. But actually, it's about how is that all laddering up to that bigger systemic change. Poverty Alliance does some of that brilliantly already, don't they, in terms of bringing us all together today, bringing that lived and learned experience together, thinking about how we do policy and we do practice change. And we need all of that, but it is how do we coordinate better to make sure that we're all kind of adding value and thinking about that bigger picture. So those are some of the areas that we've been thinking about, how we want to change as an organisation and try and put some of the things that we've been talking about today into practice. We're still learning about the best way to do that, but I hope you'll see a difference in what Save the Children's doing over the next few years that really kind of brings a lot of this to life.
Thanks, Claire. And I think that reflects a lot of the themes that we've heard today, and certainly some of the work that Danny had talked about the change in roles of big organisations in civil society, and about what our role might be in supporting change to happen more broadly across civil society. So thank you for those reflections, and it'd be good to pick up on them in our table discussions. And Mal, I'm going to turn to you now, because you have some really quite extraordinary experience to reflect on, but also your work as an activist, as a campaigner over the years since the Glasgow Girls. So over to you now for some reflections.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'll start by sharing my story of how I became an activist almost 20 years ago. I can't believe it. Back in 2005, one of my school friends, Agnesa, she was also 15. She's a Roma gypsy from Kosovo. And on a Sunday morning, 14 immigration officers went to Agnesa's flat, handcuffed her father, separated the family into 2 vans, and drove them to a detention center in England called Yarlswood, and they locked them up as if they were criminals. She was 15 and she had 2 younger siblings. Now, nobody chooses to be an asylum seeker, nobody chooses to be a refugee. For children to be treated like that, I thought that was absolutely horrendous. The UK is a country that champions human rights, so was Agnesa and her family not human? I didn't know anything about campaigning, I didn't know anything about politics, I just wanted to hang around with my pals and listen to music and dance. But when this happened, I thought, no, I need to use my voice, I need to make a difference, because that could have easily been my family being treated like that. And I went to the legend that is Mr. Garvin, Mr. G as I still call him, and I said, Mr. G, we have to do something here, it's not right, this is really wrong. And before I knew it, myself and my other friends were in the BBC News and the newspapers, sharing our story and telling the world what was going on. And thankfully, 3 weeks later, Agnesa and her family were released from detention. She's safe and happy in Glasgow, but she'll never forget the horrendous experience that she went through. And sadly, so many people are still being treated like that 20 years on. Now, I think what the campaign created was awareness about the issues that we were facing at that time. But what's really powerful about the campaign is that it wasn't just about 7 schoolgirls from Drumchapel High School. It was about the whole community coming together from all walks of life, saying, you're not treating our neighbors like this, you're not treating our children like this. And 2 of my favorite people in the world are Noreen and Jean. We call them our Glaswegian grannies, because they lived in the same high-rise flats where we lived, and they would wake up every single morning to look out for the immigration vans. If they saw the vans coming, they would call every asylum seeker on the block, tell them to go and hide in the local community center while the immigration officers were going up on the lift. We need more people like Noreen and Jean. We need more people like Mr. Garvin, because we all have power. It's about recognizing that power within us and utilizing that and working together to create a movement, to create change. We were young, but we realized actually we were being listened to. And I think what we lack is that compassion and the empathy and actually really listening to people, because I think we mostly listen to respond and not listen to understand. If we listen to understand more often, this world would be very different. And at the moment, I'm working for the West of Scotland Development Education Centre. We're a global citizenship organisation, and we work with young people in schools, and we train teachers around learning for sustainability, and we do a lot of anti-racism training as well. And it's so heartening to hear the young people's ideas and voices, and they really want to create change. But again, they keep saying to me, we're not being listened to enough. Adults are not listening enough. Again and again through this work, I'm learning that this is such a big issue. And through the other freelancing work that I'm doing, I've developed a youth forum. And one of the young people told me, and it's something that will always stay with me as well, and I shared that with you, Peter, earlier. She said, silence is safe, but truth is loud. And that will stay with me. So I think for me, creating change takes all of us. To make change happen. Like I said earlier, it wasn't just about the schoolgirls coming together, it was actually about the whole village coming together and saying, no, we need to make a difference, and we will make a difference together. And it's taking the small steps that lead to big change. It can be really disheartening, it can be really tough at times. We went through a roller coaster ride campaigning because 1 minute we won with Agnesa, but the second minute we lost the Vukash family. They were getting up to put the uniform to go to school. The dawn raid happened and they were taken. Didn't see them again. So that's what makes the story realistic as well. We didn't always win, but we keep on going. And what gives me faith and hope is the community action, is the people that make the difference. And like I said before, nobody gives you power, you already have the power. It's about actually saying, what can I do with that? Because we all have a responsibility to make a difference, and we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amal. I think 20 years on, that story of the Glasgow Girls is still inspiring and is something that we need to hold on to. I think there was many things that you said there that it would be good for us to reflect on. Perhaps we can, we'll have some time at the end for a bit more discussion with our panel. But I think that need to listen and to understand, again, is a theme that I think has emerged through our discussions today about what we actually mean when we engage with communities. And I think that message that, you know, we don't always win, but we keep on going. I think, again, that's something from community organising, from citizen organising that we learn as well, is that we don't always win, but we need to have the structures and the processes in place and the capacity that when we lose, we can figure out how we win the next time and how we win better the next time. So, with all that said, you've heard some, I think, inspiring words, some reflections on how people have made change happen. What we want to do now is go into our table discussion. So if any of you are at tables that are light in numbers, join with some of your colleagues. And we're going to have 3 questions, which I don't know if they're not up on the screen, so I'll tell you them. I don't know if they can be up on the screen. But so the first one, and there should, hopefully, many of your tables, maybe not at all, but a Poverty Alliance colleague to help guide the discussion along. But what is it that inspires you or gives you hope? Maybe thinking about some of what you've heard today, but what is it that inspires you or gives you hope? And what will you or your organisation do after today to make change? And that might be continuing to do the things that you've done. It might be doubling down on some of the things that you do already, or thinking about, well, actually, what do we do differently? And then finally, I know they're up there now, what support do you need from the Poverty Alliance to make change happen? So the Poverty Alliance is a resource. We do provide support, I think, to lots of organisations. We have convening power. What is it that we can do more of in the coming years to really genuinely build a movement? What is it your organisations need from the Poverty Alliance as a network? So we've got maybe about 15, 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, to have that discussion. So have the discussion, we'll have a little bit of feedback, not every table, but a little bit of feedback, and then we'll go back to our panel. Thank you. I always hate bringing these kind of conversations to an end, but unfortunately I have to bring these conversations to an end just now. So hopefully you've had enough time to get through those 3 really quite big, chunky questions. So what we'll do is we'll take just a little bit of feedback, just to get a flavour of some of the discussions. Obviously, they're all being captured. A report will be written in due course, and you can see the results of that. But just for now, I think, just to get a bit of a flavour of what people have been talking about in response to these questions. And then we'll go back to our panel to get some final reflections on them of what they've heard and how we want to take this forward. So, if I could maybe, I'm sorry to my colleagues at the Poverty Alliance, but I'm just going to pick on people at random. Could Chloe, I can see Chloe up there. Would you like to just give us, yeah, sorry, you need a microphone. Briefly, the key things that your table was saying in terms of inspiring hope, what they'll do next, and what support we need.
Absolutely, yes. So we had a really full conversation, so I'll pick out just some key things. Key for us in inspiration and hope was listening to stories from other organisations, and particularly hearing about wins and progress from other organisations, and that way that we can feel power from that and get ideas on how to organise ourselves moving forward. We didn't necessarily speak to the second question, but in terms of the third question, we had lots and lots of ideas thinking about, we had a specific example about the Investing in Communities Fund. That's a real struggle for organisations, so perhaps some way to collectively organise and lobby around that. thinking about capacity building around tax and tax reform, utilising the Tax Justice Now campaign, and thinking about how we can simplify language, capacity build in our communities around that. Really thinking about the benefit of in-person events and forums, and also thinking about how the Poverty Alliance can support comms capacity for organisations, thinking particularly about things like social media takeovers, so thinking about how members could utilise our Instagram, for example. We also talked about the benefit that TikTok might have as well, so TikTok takeovers. Future TikTok.
Yeah, there's been a few of us talking about TikTok this afternoon, and we're going to do a little teach-in on that later on. So if anyone wants to stay afterwards, we can do that. Thanks very much, Chloe. And maybe, Annie, I see you have a microphone, so you're ready to go.
Yes, so for inspiration, we talked a little bit about how narratives that change over time, so thinking about how the vote for women, people were vilified for that back in the day, and now they're heroes. So a little bit of hope that maybe time changes the narrative, but also how it's not as hard to make changes as you might think. We were thinking a little bit about the tax workshop we were at this morning. Also finding inspiration in things like the Scottish Child Payment and how that change happened to mitigate other policies and how important that was. How important solidarity is in terms of inspiration, and that the lead comes from the people, and a great quote from Che Guevara about the people liberating themselves, and lots of other chat. And then we talked about making change, thanks so much, about outreach, door knocking, speaking to people, going to people where they are, community organising, but also then talking about how Poverty Alliance can help some of these things through networking, things like today, how much value people find to listen to the speakers today as well, membership meetings that we run being really valuable, and also maybe thinking about how MSPs could be in this space but listening rather than talking, so at the discussion tables listening rather than being on the stage talking.
Thanks very much, Annie. And Ralph, if you want to give a little bit of feedback, and then we'll maybe take a couple of comments from the audience as well, just before we go back to the panel. But Ralph.
Great. Okay. So we were particularly struck by, all of what Amal said, but particularly the two sort of quotes, I guess. Silence is safe, but truth is loud. And I think we all felt that was a really powerful thing to take away. But also listening to understand, not listening to respond. And I guess, in a sense, we were all inspired by that, but also kind of giving us food for thought in terms of how we take that into our own work. We also, like Chloe's group, at the sort of the small wins that we've heard about, small is not the right term, but kind of perhaps the hidden wins or the less heralded wins, like the Stratham bus that we heard about this morning, being inspired to hear about those and to remember that kind of things are changing all the time, as I think you said, and sometimes they are changing for the better. In terms of what we'll take into our organisations and our own work, a couple of highlights, I guess. One very specific one around building new connections with schools, having heard a lot about the role of schools and education in our communities. And then a kind of general point around trying to move away from top-down thinking in our organisation, in particular in the context of that sort of change to listening to understand, not listening to respond. And in terms of support from the Poverty Alliance, we talked about things that the Poverty Alliance already does that kind of might want to continue or more of in terms of training, but also providing things like statistics and information on poverty, and a kind of ask to help us educate people about poverty. Thanks, Ralph.
Just before we go back to our panel, is there anyone who would like to make any final reflections themselves? And we've heard a lot of really excellent points fed back there, but any just brief points? Don't feel compelled if you don't want to. Okay, that's what happens when I spring things on people. Shouldn't do that. So, going to turn to our panel now, just for some final reflections on the kind of feedback that you've heard there about what gives people hope or inspires them. What are your reflections on what you've heard from that little bit of feedback and the discussions you're involved in? Maybe just start the same way, Jonathan, if we start with you.
I went first last time.
I
negotiate that.
It looks like we're in a negotiation situation here. I'm happy to go with you first, Jonathan. and finish with the Mall.
Okay. Lost that negotiation. It's because we've got no broad-based organisation in Scotland, you see, otherwise I would have been able to negotiate a position.
That's not what it is, Jonathan. That's not what it is.
Yeah, it was great to be on the table with the Justice and Peace guys and to hear kind of their reflections. They're kind of on a theme with the things that I've heard kind of throughout the day, really, which is kind of, in organising we talk about our vision of the world as it should be and our experience of the world as it is and the emotional reaction we often feel, the anger, the grief that we feel when our vision of the world as it should be is compromised by our experience of the world as it is. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do with it? And there are lots of different things we can do with it, or not. We can choose to just ignore it or suppress it or kind of hope it goes away. And there seems to be quite a lot of kind of yearning of, well, I wish we had the power to be able to kind of make the change that we want to do. So I suppose I'll just close my reflections about thinking about that a little bit. So organising, again, is about building power, and you can't wish power into being. Okay? Sometimes we think of power as like some abstract thing that just exists, and some people have it, politicians or decision makers, and we don't. One of the things I've loved hearing from lots of different people on the panel and around the room is people saying, actually, we do have some power. I think, Amal, you said this. We do have some power. We define power as the ability to act. Okay? The ability to act. I think the thing that is radical and liberating about that definition is that, yeah, okay, we don't all have the same amounts of power, but we all have some. We all have some. And kind of what we try and do in organising is build relational power. That is the power that comes when different people and organisations agree to work together for the common good. And you can grow that kind of power. It's not zero sum. The more people, the more organisations, the more power, the more kind of change you can bring about. So that's power. What about justice, which is another thing that we've heard a lot about today? Desmond Tutu had this wonderful little saying, which I find really agitational. I think he was saying it as an agitation to the church. He was an archbishop. He said, sometimes we have to stop just picking people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. And I think the implication was, do something about it. Okay? That is the difference between charity and justice. He's not, by the way, saying, don't ever do any charity, or charity is terrible. He's saying that charity is not sufficient. So my slight agitation to myself and to everyone here is, how much time are we as individuals or our organisations investing in building power for justice versus pulling people out the river? Because there will always be too many people in the river for us to ever have enough people in our institutions to effectively pull out. But going upstream takes time. It's difficult. It's more controversial. It kind of feels easier and more immediately gratifying to pull people out the river than to do that hard organising work. And it takes time to do. So final few offers of things you could do that are accessible to you now. The first thing is think about your own time. How much are you, your organisations, spending in terms of that justice charity balance? Could you make a small designation of time to do some time towards building relational power each week? Could you meet with 3 new people, not to meet their needs, but to find out, to listen, to understand, not to respond, but to find out what drives them, what motivates them, where is the common ground that you could potentially organise around? We call them relational meetings or one-to-ones, and organisers like Sarah and myself have to do three of those every day as part of our organising practice. That helps us build relational power. Imagine if everybody here maybe didn't do 3 a day, but did 3 a week. The kind of power we could build, the relationships we could grow, could be really substantial. The second thing is you could think about training. We run organising training. Sarah mentioned the 6-day training that we offer earlier. We also do 3-day online training. We can come and do training here in Scotland if we're invited to do so. Another thing you could think about, we are currently, I mentioned Liverpool Citizens has just founded. We have got what are called sponsoring committees in Lancashire, Bristol, Cambridge, Hull, Sheffield, and Sweden at the moment. Groups of people and organisations who are like, this organising thing sounds kind of interesting. We're not entirely sure about it, but we're committed to work together to explore it and think about, is this the right thing for our patch? Would we like to have organising here? And if so, what would it mean to make that happen? There is no reason why Scotland or people and communities in Scotland couldn't do the same thing. And the final thing is, in Wales, we're facing elections in 2026 for our Senedd. We're pretty terrified about it. We've got a new electoral system that is going to play into the hands of Reform. Reform are currently polling, we're a non-partisan organisation, but we are really worried about a society and a country that continues to be welcoming to people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And we are really worried about the impact of that kind of election. We're starting to think about our organising strategy now. We're starting to think about getting people registered to vote. It was great to work with the Poverty Alliance this year on our voter registration champion scheme for the UK general election. Maybe there could be some interesting opportunities there for you guys to dip your toes into experimenting with organising in the run-up to the elections, and we'd be well up for working with you on those. So I hope those provide some practical ways in which you can take some action for hope.
Thanks very much, John. Claire?
I think one of the things I'm thinking about is how we diversify bringing newer and older voices together. There's lots of familiar faces in the room, but there's also lots of new voices as well, and I think it's really important that we have both of those things. And are we listening to everybody that needs to be part of this conversation? How do we reach out to perhaps some of the more marginalised voices who are not as represented in the room? So I think that's something that we need to think about, and I think that makes what we're doing so much the richer. So I think that's thinking, but that's also about power as well, and how we're kind of unlocking and shifting power, not only you know between us as much as anything else, and how we work together. I wanted to also reflect on some of the, I think it was this table that was talking about kind of how narratives change. So I wanted to highlight some of the work that Save the Children's doing at the moment around public attitudes. So I think part of the picture that we need to understand in order to make real progress on tackling poverty in Scotland is understanding what the Scottish public thinks about these issues. And actually that makes me quite hopeful, because over the last year we've been doing lots of research, we've done polling, we've done a citizens' assembly. That work is just being pulled together at the moment, but over 80% of people in Scotland think child poverty is a big issue and we need to be doing more about it. I think it's actually over 85% support action on some of the big drivers of poverty: housing, childcare, better paid jobs. It's a little bit lower on social security, but it's still around 65% would support action. So actually the work that we've been doing to understand where we are as a country, we're turning that into, well, how then do we talk about poverty? How do we talk about some of these issues to bring more people with us? I think one of my reflections would be the sustainability of action around, particularly I'm thinking about child poverty. The UK government had targets to end child poverty by 2020 that were very easily swept away when government changed at Westminster. We've currently got 2030 targets for Scotland. I do not want to be sitting here and having 2040 targets. So really thinking about how we build sustainable change is about understanding the broader public and how we bring more people along on that journey with us. So the work we're doing, I think, is giving me hope, because I think there is support to do more, and we hope over the next few months to turn that into a resource that all of us can use about how we talk about some of these issues, how we say things, what we say and how we say them are really important to bring people with us. And that's part of the kind of power dynamics as well. So I hope that will be a useful contribution and something quite practical that will enable us to drive things forward as well.
Thanks, Peter. I'd like to reflect on what this table said in terms of solidarity. And solidarity is so important, because who are we without each other? You know, and we're all at different stages in life. And the way I see my work, and in particularly my activism, that it's a journey. And during that journey, we go through different stages and opportunities, and it's those opportunities that we can either say it's just for us, or actually no, it's for all of us, and how I can encourage other people to join me on that platform and to share the story and the power of stories as well. for me, I see it in two sides: is the education side of the work that I do, and then the other side is using the arts to tell stories. Because we briefly chatted about how we don't want to preach at people; we want to work with people, and to actually really, again, going back to what I said earlier, really listening to understand and having that compassion and empathy. And it's there. We just need to continue working on it. And I think events like this today, bringing people together, is so important. And I'm really glad we're back to doing this after going through a period of time where we weren't doing this. But there is so much change happening, and we need to hear about those positive stories. I don't think we hear enough about what's good that's happening in the world, because it can be really sad to see what's going on. But it's those powerful stories that give us the hope and the encouragement to make a difference. And definitely when we're united and working together using our different skills and resources, we can definitely make a difference. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amal. Thank you all our speakers for those final thoughts and reflections. We're almost at 4 o'clock, so it's my job to make sure you get out of here as soon as possible. There's so much to reflect on from today. I think it's been just across the piece, fantastic discussions taking place. There are many quotes that I've written down that I will reflect on more, and we can, as I said, there will be a report to conclude this. There was something that Gordon McRae from Shelter said in the workshop earlier that I picked up on, and he was talking about changing the political tolerance to the housing crisis amongst the public in Scotland. And I think that's something that we could apply to all aspects of poverty in Scotland, changing the political tolerance, the fact that we simply accept, too often, we simply accept that this is the way it is, these are the levels of inequality we have, this is the level of poverty that we have, and we can change it little bits around the edge, but you know, that's just the way it is. I think Claire has just provided us with some of the evidence to say that actually people think that isn't acceptable, but we need to build to make greater action come from that. And I think we've heard, you know, in great volume today about the different approaches that are there for us to make change. From community organising to better use of our insider policy work, to changing the narrative, to using digital more creatively. There are lots of things that we need to do. And as I've said a couple of times now, we will gather our learning together from this conference. We will produce a report that will have actions in it. But for the poverty lines, we have been working for the last 6 months or so on thinking about what is the big next step we need to take. And we've settled around this idea of activating our network more ambitiously over the next year, over the coming year. And that's what we will be setting to do, coming from this conference, using the learning that we have from this conference. We will be looking at how do we activate our network, how do we support our network, how do we broaden it and make it bigger. It is much bigger than it was a couple of years ago, but how do we grow it still? How do we match that growth in our network with far more bold, far more stretching demands on government? How do we manifest that demand to government? 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we had a conference on making change happen. Back then, part of that led to the development of Challenge Poverty Week, which has certainly raised the tempo in terms of poverty in Scotland. We need to do something similar again. So we're looking towards next year, next October, to have something far bigger, far grander. Next year is an important year. We'll be developing a new child poverty strategy in Scotland. We'll be still in the depths of a housing crisis. We need clearly to organise our resources and put them to greater use, and we need to demand more from our government. So whether it's in community organising, whether it's in using digital better, we will be doing more. And I sincerely hope that all of you will be part of that and very active parts of that, of making change happen next year. Now all it remains for me to do is do a big long list of thank yous. I'll try and keep them quite tight. So thanks firstly to the staff team at the Poverty Lines, particularly to Ruth and the policy team who did so much work to prepare the conference, also to the admin team, to Sinead and Paul and all the admin team who have made this run so smoothly throughout the day. Of course, a big thank you to all of our speakers. Both our panels were fantastic, but the workshops, I think, were of an incredibly high standard throughout the day. Thank you to all our board members and trustees who have been with us throughout the day and who've actively taken a part in helping us deliver the conference today. Thank you also to the staff team at the conference centre. I think they've done a fantastic job, so thank you to all of those. Final thing, I think, unless someone notifies me that I've forgotten something, but evaluation. So you'll be emailed an evaluation. There's a QR code, I think, that you can use to get access to that evaluation form. It's really important that we understand what worked for you today and what didn't, so that we can do it better in the future. And that's it. We'll see you all not next year, much sooner than that. One thing to say is that for those of you who are members of the Poverty Alliance, there'll be an AGM, because you'll note this isn't an AGM. There'll be an AGM at the end of February. You'll be hearing more about that just next week. For those of you who aren't Poverty Alliance members, then please do join us. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your weekends. Enjoy the season. See you all again soon.